All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to join in here. For those of you that are on right now, if you can, feel free during the session today to drop any questions in the Q&A box. And during the session, we'll be checking them out. Perhaps there are some opportunities for us to answer those questions right away. But we'll also have Q&A at the end as well. All right, well then let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Sabatini, SVP of Enterprise Solutions here at Data Axle, and happy to be taking the next hour to walk through the future of identity resolution, a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in the marketplace today. And let me go ahead and start by bringing in my panel. First, Jay Civisilum. Jay, can you come on? Hello, Jay.
Hey, good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon. Jay, can you introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit about Jay Civisilum?
Yeah, absolutely. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jay Civisilum, Executive Vice President and Chief Growth Officer here at UCare, a nonprofit health plan serving more than 600,000 individuals across the lovely state of Minnesota. And as Chief Growth Officer, my mission is really to help us develop products, help us sell and market services, and most importantly, deliver exceptional experiences for our members. And so that's why I'm really excited about today's conversation on identity management, because at the end of the day, especially in healthcare, the root of driving great experiences comes from knowing your members. After all, it's healthcare. You can't afford to be inexact. So again, thank you all. Send us questions. And Mark, I'll turn it back to you.
Hey, wonderful. Thank you, Jay, and thank you for being here. Next, I'd like to introduce Mark Dye. Mark, can you come on to the front page of the stage here?
Hey there. Hey, Mark. Hey, Jay. My name is Mark Dye, and my background real quick was I co-founded Bizzo in 2008, which was the first B2B audience platform, which we sold to LinkedIn. And then I went over and became Chief Strategy Officer for another startup called Sixth Sense. And I was there for 3 years. And then I joined Bombora in 2017 as Chief Strategy Officer for 6 years. So I've been in the B2B digital data space for quite a while. And now I've co-founded another company called B2B Tech Group. And that's me.
All right, wonderful. And just want to make sure that my slides are moving forward. So I finally was able to move that forward. Thank you both for being here today. There's a lot of, great opportunity here to talk about the challenges that are facing marketers today with the ever-changing identity landscape. Every day there seems to be new challenges, new regulations, new rules, and governance that brands need to follow. So what we're going to focus on today is kind of touching on a couple of topics here. Number one, how do we stay ahead in a cookie limited world? What can brands do, both B2C and B2B, to be able to bring together identity and stitch together all the information that's available to them to be able to handle that identity management and ultimately identity resolution with all the tools and capabilities that brands have at their fingertips today? The second piece is really just some practical approaches, right? How are we managing data in this ever-changing landscape? And then finally, adapting to this new identity landscape, right? We all have marketing techniques, marketing tools, but as the ecosystem changes and we're stitching together all of this information to understand who we're talking to, who is visiting our sites and seeing our content. But on the other side, there's a lot of anonymous information, and how do organizations handle that as well? So some of the topics that we'll talk about today, I'll leave this up here. A couple of you have already started to jump into the chat, but please feel free to send over some questions, and I'll keep my eye on that as we go through this. But let's get through the first question, and I'll pose it to Mark. How is the decline of third-party cookies and the masking of IP addresses reshaping the way businesses approach identity resolution?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's very important in B2B specifically, because if you think about B2B with ABX, ABM strategies, what you're really trying to do is to tie an individual, a device, right, back to a company, because you sell to a company, not necessarily to a person. And third-party cookies have been, a great way to target people for programmatic advertising, because it only has to be so accurate, right? So cookies are limited to start with. Their use cases are really intended, right, for large scale identification where it doesn't have to be all that accurate. And with Google, when Apple did consumer opt-in, 70 to 80% opted out. And Chrome is going to follow a similar path, and we're already seeing a degradation in third-party cookies, which almost every data vendor relies on. And then IP addresses, similarly in B2B, are core to how people identify companies. Well, IP addresses are also being masked by Apple and by Chrome, and that's growing. And in addition to that, in the US, 70+% of companies are on shared IP addresses. So IP addresses, like cookies, again, we're not always perfect, and they're more art than science, but both those identifiers are actually declining pretty rapidly. And so we're advising a lot of companies about how to convert off of those signals onto a more first-party oriented data set.
Thanks, Mark. And before we go over to Jay, how much more difficult is this challenge in B2B than B2C, in your opinion?
Well, if you look at almost every data vendor out there that's in the digital space, they are hugely reliant on third-party cookies and IP addresses. So in B2B, particularly, we're going to have to transition off of those. And again, they were built for massive scale and not accuracy. And we're moving into a world where quality matters, which we're going to talk a lot about today, where quality really matters. And so, like we're doing a test right now, I'll give you just an example, not naming any names, but we're firing 4 IP vendor pixels on the exact same page for a brand. So exact same impression, exact same device. When we look at the results and we're showing the brand this, number one, of those 4 vendors, they rarely agree on who that, what company that IP address represents. And then when they do both identify the company, over 70% of the time they disagree on who the company is. So it just highlights how dependent people are on IP resolution and how inaccurate it can be. And so we're leading a lot of discussions about moving off of that. And what people have to realize is, that a lot of this scale that people talk about with third-party cookies and IP addresses are just, it's all false positives. And so we have to get kind of off of this scale dependence and really start to focus on quality data versus scale.
Wonderful. And I'm sure as we get into the value of first-party data later on in this conversation, you can connect the dots there as well. So Jay, same question to you as we look at the decline of third-party cookies and the masking of IP addresses. How do you see that from a UCare perspective, B2C, but the challenges that healthcare may be facing versus some other industries like retail or travel and hospitality?
Yeah, thank you for that. And Mark Dye did a great job, and I'll just say it's a yes and, right? So a couple other things are going on. So one thing I would just call out is that certainly in healthcare, you need to be exact on what it is, right? If you're dealing with different consumers, you never want to be in a position where you don't have that identity right, and you're sending someone a message about some kind of heart program, but really all they came in for was a broken pinky, right? Like you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. But I would say some of the big things that come out are, hey, in a world where, and I love how Mark said this, that we as B2C marketers have probably gotten a little too addicted to scale over quality with the ubiquity of our vendors saying, hey, won't name any names, use certain tools or technologies, reach everything. And we've kind of forgotten some of the basics. So whether you're in healthcare or not, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but this notion of what are you trying to do to build more consent-driven marketing, meaning that, the good old-fashioned newsletter where you might show a little value in that, hey, give us just a little bit of information, maybe a first name, maybe an email address, get a little info, give us a little bit more, and then we'll personalize that, right? Building your profile, building your first-party data strategy, that becomes core to everything that you do. One really practical example I'll give you is that we're certainly working to build our own set of conversion APIs. And what I mean by that is across the B2C space, we all have our high value activities that we're trying to optimize on. So can we build our APIs so that when we know that activity happens, we can actually use that direct signal as a trigger to launch different media campaigns, again, instead of relying just on cookies. So I'll close with this, say everything Mark said applies. And if there's any big message you get out of today, it's you've really got to start to lean into quality over quantity and really look at different ways, people, process, and technology to build your internal capabilities.
That's great. And for the audience, anytime Jay says really good things about Mark, he's actually talking about both of us. And if there's challenges or problems that he's talking about, it's usually me. So as we start to talk about this scale, and we're typically talking about third-party data, right? And the movement today is about how to better leverage first-party data, all of the information that you have available at your fingertips of first-party data interactions, first-party data you're collecting. What are some of the challenges that brands are facing as this transition happens, right? Because the third party it's not just turning it on and turning it off. We still need the third party data to help with activation or crosswalking identity and some other use cases. But what are some of the challenges you feel would be facing the brands? And we'll start with you, Jay, this time. So within your industry, where do you see some of those challenges?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones, but the biggest challenges we're facing is this proliferation of what I might call point solutions. So what I mean by that is in a health environment, you might have a fantastic organization that says, you know what, we are the best at helping people manage their diabetes, lose weight, and have an effective, amazing life. So fantastic. So often what happens is that provider of services might go talk to a hospital, might go talk to a clinic, might go talk to a health insurance company. So what happens is you have a large list of B2C individuals. You now have carved out a group, you send them over to that point solution, and now they're in their own little ecosystem. So what happens, that data almost never comes back. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And so that can cause a lot of conflicts where it could be that, the point solution provider is saying the best thing you should do is ABC. And that's fantastic, right? And their limited set of knowledge on that person, that might make a lot of sense, but they don't have that full body of knowledge, so they're missing out on that. And this applies in other industries too. As someone who came from retail back in the day, just there are a lot of retail places now that are doing the store within a store concept, right? Where you might have your core commerce platform, but then you're working with a Samsung. They're really good at this. That's a great example. Or a beauty band where you're going to then send them to your partner's ecosystem for a little experience. It's the same thing. It is a point solution where that data gets mixed up in the blender. And by the time you get it back, you don't know if somebody's looking for lipstick or a colonoscopy. And Mark, I tell you, you don't want to get those two things mixed up.
I'm going to limit my comments there, but that's a great point, Jay. Mark, your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, it's interesting because at both Bizzo and Bombora, I also led the teams that built the publisher co-ops, right? So we have massive publisher co-ops on both of those. And so the publishers and the brands are really facing the same challenge, which is how do you get people to register? How do you get them to self-identify, right? So that you can start to treat them as first-party data. And so there needs to be a strategy that says, here's how I use third-party data, offline data, and I'll use single sign-on as a great example. Like if you use single, so what you're trying to do is make it as easy as possible for that end user to consent and sign up for whatever service they're looking for. And single sign-on is a great way to do that. However, like Google will only give you a Gmail address, right? If that happens. Well, you need then, and I'll put a plug in here for Data Axle, but you need a great data source behind that so you can append what Data Axle knows about that person, right, to that Gmail address. And the other challenge in B2B specifically is no one registers using their professional email address. Like no one signs up for a newsletter using their professional email address or signs up for product information, right? Everyone is using personal Gmail. In fact, we're seeing a lot of people are opening up Gmail accounts just to register for stuff. And so you need to be able to crosswalk from a personal email address into a professional profile in order to start really building out your first party data set. And so what we're advising our clients to do is number one, really understand those vendors that have cookies and IP addresses and start to sort out the good ones from the bad ones. And so there's a whole methodology around that. But once you get to someone that you trust that their data is fairly accurate, then you've got to tie it to real world profiles with like Data Axle's 360, you can start to really build out rich profiles. So I think, the transition that's happening is, the IP addresses and third-party cookies were pretty much a black box, and who knows what's in there. And I can tell you from experience, there's a lot of garbage in there. And now we're starting to transition to really a first data strategy that incorporates that. So kind of where we are.
Yeah. So Mark, is this, I know you've talked about a truth set before. Is this kind of tie into that, as we start to talk a little bit about transitioning to known identities?
Yeah, what we do a lot for clients is, you got to start with a truth set. And what we'll do is, go out and find niche data sets, right? And I use commercial real estate as an example because I've got, they're one of our big partners. So BizCred is one of the great providers of specifically commercial real estate business. And you take that data that is, again, small in size, not a lot of scale, but at least it's accurate. And then you start to test the data that you're bringing in-house against those known true sets. And so whenever you're looking at a broad B2B data set, you can't look at it as one holistic, huge data set. You got to look at it like, okay, who am I trying to reach and how accurate is this data for this specific use case? And so what we do is build small samples of truth so we can compare data against that. Then you've got a benchmark. At least the data you're dealing with, right, is accurate. Because again, what we find over and over again, which is really mind-blowing, is that people in B2B, they kind of think, oh, it's B2B data, everybody has the same data. It's all just B2B data, like, who cares, right? The reality is you've got to get under the hood and look at this data because it's all sourced differently. Some of it's opt-in and privacy compliant, some of it is not. And so we really advise people to really dig in and know the data that's building. And we're going to talk about this with AI in a little bit, but data quality is just becoming so important in this world because, when you're doing display advertising and you're paying a $4 CPM, like who cares if it's only 30% accurate, right? Because there just isn't that much, at risk. But when you start to do AI, when you start to do CTV and paying huge CPMs, this data better be accurate. And so, we're seeing this transition, what I call a flight to quality. Finally, we're seeing people starting to really dig into the data they're using and understand what's there, not just take someone's word for it.
Yeah, and Mark,
Yeah.
just to add one thing to that that really resonates with me, just to make something explicit that I think you're saying, it's when you do the flight to quality, every marketer on this call should be aware of, hey, what's their value exchange they're offering to folks to make sure that we can get some of that truth set of information, right? Like in my world, working at a healthcare organization, there's not a natural inclination to share accurate information, right? What's the value exchange? But if I can say, hey, you know what? I see you're turning 65. Would you like to learn about the complexities of retiring on Medicare? Oh, by the way, you know what? We have some arrangements with even a financial planner to help you pay for it. Would you like to know more about that? I'm always surprised by, in modern times, how often as marketers, we sometimes forget that we have to give to get, and how do you build that progressive profile for folks? I think that's really key. So, Mark asked, I'll turn it back to you, but I just wanted to add that because I do think it's important with this flight to quality is that you've got to give to get. And sometimes marketers have forgotten that, I feel, in the last 10 years.
Sure. No, absolutely. Great point, Jay. And it's, quality is both how clean is it, but also how accurate is the information. So, as brands are bringing all this first party data together, leveraging third party data quality, takes many shapes and forms. Many people on this webinar have heard me say that the future of identity will be owned by the brands, the marketer, the advertiser, the true first party. And the third parties will be contributing sources moving forward. But in fact, as we look at a lot of the privacy laws that are out there, identity really belongs to the individual, the consumer, the contact within a business. And if the brands don't have clean and accurate ways of organizing all the data and keeping it connected to a known identity, even if for a while that's an anonymous identity, when that individual decides to say, hey, I want to raise my hand and be removed from a list or opt out or not give my consent, the brand is the one who the consumer is seeing, and the brand needs a way to stitch that back to honor that consent. But on that topic, the number of privacy laws are growing both here in the States and globally. So, Jay, I'll go to you first. What are you seeing out there as some of the struggles that brands are having dealing with all the privacy laws? And, I think more importantly, how is this impacting the IT teams internally, where legal or compliance may be knocking on their door?
Yeah, I mean, we often talk about the alphabet soup, right, between GDPR and CCPA, and then every state seems to be popping up a new regulation, right? It can be tough to understand as a modern marketer what you have to do. And one suggestion I have for the group here is that, hey, every marketer has to have a basic understanding of how legal and privacy works, because I've often found that in order to drive your transformation, it's going to have to be the marketing person that serves as a bridge between your legal teams, your IT teams, and whomever are your business drivers. So give you an example in healthcare, right? We're by definition risk adverse. Our whole point is to measure risk, understand it, and then support people mitigate those risks. So as you might imagine, from a legal and privacy perspective, our attorneys are really, really geared that way. So as a marketer, it's your job to understand, hey, when we think about this risk, it's like you would anywhere else, there's different classifications. There's some stuff that, you know what, in healthcare, things like your name, things like your email address, there can be considered PHI, protected health information. That's a categorization above even PII, personally identifiable information. And yeah, so even an email address can be considered PHI. So if you're not able to help articulate to your legal teams, hey, what are we using it for, and get to really good granularity on the use cases, you can be in a world of pain. And so that's been really great. And actually, I'll give a shout out to Data Axle. You guys have been great when I've wanted to talk to some of your privacy folks and have a legal to legal conversation and help explain, wait a minute, it's not that scary, let's go through it. The other part I think is really interesting. You talked about IT teams, but Yesterday, I'll just give a nod to my IT colleagues. It was National IT Professional Appreciation Day. So hopefully everybody sent their CIO a basket of goodies. And we were talking this morning, and with this proliferation of rules, it was interesting. My CIO said, "Hey, Jay, what will be most helpful for me is, yeah, I want your use cases. Yeah, I want your long-term vision, but can you help me carve out a set of principles?" I'm not talking necessarily policies, but like, Jay, what are those principles you want us to adhere to so that even if we're meeting IT InfoSec requirements, even if we're meeting legal requirements, we're hitting the spirit and the ethical requirements of using some of this data. And that really struck me as something profound. So we have put together a set of guiding principles that really sit on top of our formal policies and procedures. And that's something that we gut check everything we do from an IT perspective. If do not pass go, if it's something you wouldn't do with your grandma, if it's something that's creepy and not cool, doesn't matter if it passes legal muster, we're going to drive it that way. So yeah, there's a lot to go in this world. And I'd love to hear what Mark thinks about it from a B2B perspective. So there's some overlap in those challenges even.
Yeah, let's go there, Mark.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. And the thing, kind of going back, Jay, to your kind of guiding principles, right? One of the guiding principles that's common in almost every privacy regulation is the opt-out ability, right? Consumers have to say, take my name out of this data set. Well, I'll go back to third-party cookies for a moment. The way most third-party cookies are set is with cookie sinks, right? So you're firing multiple tags on a site so that everybody can share in that impression and set their own cookie. Well, what that does in reality is if I'm the provider of that impression, right? I have the first party relationship with that individual, and then I allow third parties to fire their tags on that impression as well. And again, that's the way the vast majority of identity is done today in the digital space. Well, that opt-out capability is completely gone because I have no idea, right, who vendor A, B, C, or D, right? They've identified that person with their own profiles, with their own cookie IDs, and that goes into their data set. And so that chain of custody, right, is broken. And so when you're heavily reliant on third-party data, first of all, the opt-out capability virtually goes away, and that's kind of the very first hurdle that is in common with almost every privacy regulation. And then with IP addresses, in particular in Europe, for example, they're already truncating IP addresses, so those become very very hard to manage. And so the theme of this comes back to we've been operating in a world where we've handed our identity over to third parties to manage for us at a high scale, and that's just not sustainable in this world, right? You have to bring, and Mark, this goes back to the theme that you talk about all the time, is the brands have to come back to owning this data, right? Or just the opt-out alone, right, is a good enough reason why you should be moving in that direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's further compounded by the fact that there's all these point solutions. Jay, you were just talking about one point solution, but an average marketer may have 10, 20, 30, 50 different point solutions across the MarTech stack and the ad tech stack. What do you guys see as the common mistakes that brands are making when integrating the data across multiple point solutions? Either one of you can go first.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here, Jake. I love this subject, right? So we do a lot of work in this area, and what you'll find is, in almost every major brand, I've got an ABM platform, maybe, right? I've got a marketing automation platform. I've got a CRM platform. I've got a CDP, right? A lot of the clients we work with literally have 40 and 50 different point solutions that they operate. And that data, because in B2B in particular, most of those platforms come with their own data baked in. Again, going back to this fallacy that all B2B data is the same. So if I've got an ABM platform that has its own data, I've got a contact management platform that has its own data, I've got a CRM platform that has its own data, right? That data, it has to be joined, right? You have to have some way to understand the effects. And what happens in the real world is, okay, I'm running a campaign using a third-party cookie in a vacuum, and then I don't have that tied to my site visitation. I don't have that tied to my CRM. So all the great work that I'm doing to attract attention, I can't measure it because none of the data is joined. And we see this time and time again that these platforms are in silos. They're not joined, which is one of the points that Jay made very early on. And you've got to have a centralized data strategy because you've got to actually use common keys between these systems to understand who you're actually affecting and at what scale. And that is, I mean, in 2024, I'm blown away how many companies still operate these platforms in a silo and don't join the data. And again, it's because everyone assumed B2B data was the same, so no one really paid much attention to data strategy. Well, now you have to, because you can't even measure what you're doing if you don't have the data joined.
Yeah. Jay, do you see that as well in the B2C side in healthcare?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything Mark said, 100%. Literally right before this call, was spending 2 hours with our team, including like our chief architect, and talking about this very topic. And I'll just add to what Mark eloquently said from a B2C and really from a healthcare perspective. Just let's make this real. I mean, it is often the case there are people on this phone call, you maybe go to your doc, right? But then your kid has an earache, and then so you go to the latest emergency room because you're not gonna say, oh, I'm gonna wait till Monday to take care of this, right? Then I'm in Minnesota, so when it gets cold, we go down to Arizona for the winter, and so you break your leg hiking, you're going to a different doctor there. So imagine everything Mark just talked about, but on steroids, because you've got all these independent ecosystems. So how the heck do you stitch that together with your data dictionary, your common definitions, and especially now if in that example, that provider in Arizona thinks you're one of their members, so they're starting to send you advertising, but you've already come back to Minnesota, right? You're only there for a month when it was really cold. Yeah, everything Mark said applies. And again, it does surprise me, even in the B2C world, this lack of understanding on the importance of identity resolution, having that primary key, golden record of tying this together and mandating and working with your point solutions providers to say, well, you know what, you've got to open up the hood and make sure that we can carry that information with it, because we need to own that identity resolution across our ecosystem of partners and just not you, point solution partner A.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into this a little bit. And talk a little bit about some of the technologies to set yourself up for success as a brand, whether you're B2B or B2C. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing here at Data Axle with our Audience 360 solution. And really the goal is about centralizing the data. Let the brand take back their data and take control of that. And we do that through leveraging an enterprise identity spine, really at the center of this axle. And what the enterprise identity spine does is it helps the brand bring all that first party and third party data together, PII, as well as all the ad tech and digital data, and brings it to a persistent ID that we help the brand to build and manage over time. And, as many businesses, just, think of the two different areas that you cover on this panel. What's an individual, what's a household, what's a site, what's a business, right? These are business rules that need to come from the business. So the challenges that brands are having out there today that we're solving with and that we're addressing with the Audience 360 solution is really focused on these 3 points. The data unification, right? When you think of all of those different sources of data, even if you just focused on the first party tools alone, there's dozens of sources of data that are coming together into any organization. And to do this right, understanding the consumer, the customer, the prospect, the unknown anonymous entity, how do you bring all that data together across all those different partners and sources from zero to third party? The second challenge is that all the federation of IDs, every single source has a different ID, right? And we're not going to change all those sources to have one ID. So we need to resolve that back to the brand's ID. Now, in the process that we're all used to today, the brand has to still take their data and match it with the data source or the technology partner or the ad tech partner or the third-party identity spine. So what we're doing here at Data Axle in the Audience 360 solution is bringing that together so the brand now has control of that. And the third piece are all those point solutions that we talked about. How can you possibly do measurement, as Mark said, let alone focus on the true ROI that each one of those platforms are supposed to be bringing to the table, unless I get my arms around all of them and resolve the ID of the point solution to the ID that the brand has, so that we can truly be looking at one consumer. So that's what Audience 360 is delivering for us today. Data unification, the federation of the IDs under the control of the brand, as well as optimizing the ecosystem. Because most marketers understand they're working with one or many of these partners in every single area. And there's categories we don't even have on this visual. So when you start to think of the depth of and the levels of challenge of bringing all those identities together, that's what we're focused on. Other companies are focused on the front end, and there are many companies dealing with digital identity data, as well as other data PII based that competes with what Data Axle has to offer. But at the end of the day, bringing this together helps us understand that single view of the person. So all of these challenges and best practices we were talking about earlier, plus the next generation topics we're going to talk about here in a minute, all are driven off of this concept. How do we get our arms around all of that data to understand that person, that individual? Because all of the marketing concepts and use cases and technologies all drive from help me understand the consumer or the business or the business contact. So having Audience 360 at the center there is how we're doing that. And that's really where it then comes out to all of the applications and the technology that brands are using today. And how can we enable them to point those tools at this single source of data so they're all leveraging the same data at the same time? And more importantly, the exhaust data from all the interactions with individuals is now coming back to the same point. So when we want to get to that point of truly interacting with the individual at the point where they're interacting with your brand, this is how you can drive ROI from all the tools that you've already spent. So just to leave you with one last visual, it's about your data being at the center, your data, plus the multiple third-party data sources you're using for demographics or firmographics, and the multiple third-party data sources you're using for identity crosswalking and onboarding. So that's what you're going to hear a lot about from Data Axle and Audience 360 for the rest of this year, as well as next year. But let's get into the next generation here and get back to talking about number one, identity resolution. Jay, from a healthcare specific challenge perspective, how is identity resolution helping to improve and drive your business?
Yeah, identity resolution, as I said in my intro, is really the unspoken key to unlocking healthcare. At the end of the day, there may be slightly different motivations, but anyone involved in the healthcare space has a fundamental goal of improving the quality of life for an individual. And let's just start with the end in mind. If that's the goal, what's really interesting, Mark, is that the vast majority of a person's health is determined by factors outside of the typical doctor's visit, right? So doctor's visit, you might get your blood pressure, your height, your weight. But the reality is that one of the single biggest predictors is actually your zip code. Because with your zip code, you can start to see, do you have access to food? Do you have access to health care? Do you have good schooling? These are all factors that go into what we call a whole health profile. So bear with me. If we're saying we want to improve a person's health, and yet what makes up the person, the vast majority of that is actually outside of the typical health sphere, then in healthcare, one of our biggest challenges is how do we pull that together? So we talk about these social drivers of health, but working with a partner like Data Axle, other providers, it's about okay, we stitch together, we know this, we know like the doctor's room experience about the person, but what can we understand about, is the person getting enough food? Is the person getting enough transportation? And you might not think it's a big deal, but according to the CDC, it's almost 30% of Americans have some kind of disability. So something that's visual, physical, mental, cognitive, right? 30% of our Americans have a disability, and yet we still market to them like they're one size generic fits all. So in healthcare, you've got to be exact. An example might be if a person has had a hysterectomy and can no longer give birth, you don't want to the next day start to encourage them to sign up for, the well baby programs. And sometimes that can happen. And so with healthcare, the challenge is how do you integrate all of these different sources that come from so many different fields? And one last one I'll call out is how do you separate the individual from the household? Like to me, a really good example, I don't know if others, put it in the chat, have a Fitbit scale or some other kind of device in their home where you might step on it. We want to be really accurate and say, hey, that person that we're getting those measurements, is that Jay Civisilum? Is that Mark Sabatini? Is that Mark Dye? And being able to pull the individual from the householding is absolutely critical to our space. So yeah, it's complicated. We'll talk about some solutions in a second, but Mark asks, it's a challenging but super fun time to be in healthcare right now as a marketer.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of double-edged swords in there as well. But as I've mentioned to you before, that Fitbit scale always blows me away. Our scale here just reads out the answer, and it's crazy how my son just walks around wondering why the scale says one at a time, please, whenever I get on. But having said that, Mark Dye, what are your thoughts on identity resolution for B2B?
Yeah, the identity is really where B2B and B2C kind of separate, because in B2B, you're selling to a company which is made up of a buying committee. And people on that buying committee enter the sales cycle at different times. And I'll use keyword as a great example. This is something that we kind of proved out at Bombora, is that if you look at keywords as a search strategy, right? If I'm an end user, let's say I'm buying a CRM system, because that's easy, right? Early in the sales cycle, you get the end users, right? And they're searching on things like usability and UI and reporting, because that's the sales VP, right? Looking at that technology, right? As that sales cycle progresses, then the IT folks enter the fray, and they're looking for, does this system integrate with other systems? How am I going to support this thing, right? And then as that sales cycle continues, towards the end, the finance guys get involved, right? Because they want to know the terms and conditions. And so when you're identifying the customer journey in B2B, you've got to tie all these engagements back to the company, because it's the only way to accurately know where you are in the cycle. And the mistake that we see happen is, again, I'll go back to data quality, is that if I'm relying on one vendor with one IP solution to tell me who this company is, and it's only right 30% of the time, well, guess what? All that downstream tracking and customer journey is garbage in, garbage out, right? It doesn't work. And so when you're doing B2B marketing and you really want to understand, an omni-channel strategy, if you don't have a core understanding of the data and you don't have a truth set, and Mark, I love those visuals you showed with all the ecosystem, right? If you don't have that data stitched together, then you can't effectively monitor and measure anything that you're doing. And one of the biggest problems that we see in B2B is that scale, the chase for scale has created massive amounts of false positives. And I would argue that in B2B in particular, the biggest challenge is you're throwing away effectiveness for scale. And that's what's really got to change, I think. And as marketing budgets, some of my friends in in the B2B CMO landscape are telling me their budgets are cut 30-40% this year, right? Everyone is trying to do more with less. Well, then that scaled strategy doesn't work because you're
Yeah.
wasting so much and you can't measure it. And so, I would argue that, you should start, and people focus on features and functions of software, not data quality. And I would
Yeah.
argue you got to start with data quality first because, just because that software has great bells and whistles, if you don't have good data in it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, thank you for reminding me to go back to this slide. Data quality in our view happens in this center function, right? We're bringing all that data together. But when we talk about identity resolution and the point you're talking about, the identity resolution in most cases, and I'm not even scratching the surface with point solutions represented on this slide, but it needs to start with quality identity management, which happens in the quality of the data you're organizing in the center. All of the point solutions now, and it won't be long before every point solution has a button that talks about identity resolution or a feature that talks about identity resolution, but it's only going to resolve what it has access to. So when you then start to talk about the truth set, whether you're bringing in the B2C link file from Data Axle of business owners at their home address, or you're bringing in multiple other third-party sources, that's how you're building your truth set. That needs to be in the center. And then the point solutions become accessories that now can drive quality identity resolution. That's the way I see it. It sounds like you're looking at it the same way, Mark.
Yeah, it's just critical that whatever data is at the core of your systems has to have as many linkages as possible and has to be complete, right? And I use, like, we get so many B2B marketers that want to use Google Analytics. Well, Google Analytics doesn't understand the company that I work for. It understands me as a device. It doesn't understand the companies I work for. So you need to, in B2B in particular, you need to make sure that you understand the company that all these devices represent.
Yep, absolutely. So before I move on to the next topic, I want to remind all of our viewers to please send in some questions. We're getting some coming in right now. But if you have any questions for Mark or Jay, please feel free to tee them up. But really what we want to focus on now is we're looking at the last 10 to 12 minutes here is emerging trends, future trends, innovations. Jay, I'm going to start off with you. You're in a very exciting sector where, as we all get older, we're all interacting with the healthcare ecosystem more and more. What are your thoughts and what are you seeing as far as future trends and innovations around identity management, and identity resolution?
Yeah, and healthcare, it is super exciting, right? It's healthcare, just to put it in perspective, kind of 19% of the country's GDP. So you're talking a total addressable market that dwarfs almost anything else on the planet. So it's amazing. So as you might imagine, there's been a flood of effort here. And one of the ones that has interested me the most is this notion of how do you leverage machine learning, but also some really interesting AI experiments to really help with this identity resolution. And the reason I say that, I open this up saying you've got to be exact in healthcare, and that's absolutely true. But there's still a number of places where it's okay to have a little fuzziness in terms of determining people and go to more of a probabilistic set. So in that regard, using AI and machine learning combined to help us identify folks that might have a propensity to do X, Y, Z, it's huge. So one example that I think a lot of folks might recognize are, just even using basic, search data, that Google can help identify ahead of time where COVID or flu breaks might jump out. Now imagine that, but taken with a larger data set and just saying, oh, wait a minute, we're seeing a big spike in conditions that are caused by bad water. So take what's happening in Flint, Michigan. Those are the types of things where we can be more predictive, proactive, and personalized using AI, going above just kind of trend data and really aggregating all of this information that's out there That's huge, being able to get ahead of it. I mean, that to me is one of the biggest exciting parts of understanding population identities, household identities, and individual identities in healthcare.
All right, thank you. Mark, your thoughts on future trends, emerging trends in identity resolution?
Yeah, I'll stay on the AI bandwagon because it's what everyone wants to talk about, right? So what AI at its core, what AI does is take a very complex query structure and make it human friendly, human readable, right? The big promise of AI is I can go in and ask simple questions and let AI do the hard work. And in the past, right, in B2B in particular, if I'm a marketer and I want to understand, my ROAS or my, is LinkedIn more effective than CTV on Trade Desk or whatever it happens to be, right? You would need a BI person. You would need someone to run a query against a really complex data set and try and extract that. Well, now with AI and large language models, its ability to digest and normalize all that data gives us the promise that now a marketer can just go in and ask a very simple question and get a meaningful answer. But large language models are only as good as the data, right, that they're modeled against. And so this, again, I'm going to beat this, to death today, but data quality is even more important in an AI focused world because these tools are fantastic if they're on a quality data set, because then you get quality answers. But if you're asking the same questions and the underlying data in the LLMs is not good, then you're going to get bad answers. And so the promise of AI is really, really dependent upon the underlying quality of the data. And we're even seeing this in some of the big, in some of the big AI releases where they jumped the gun and the data sets underlying the large language models weren't very good, and the answers people started getting were wrong, right? And it's been highlighted a number of times, and that all goes back to data quality. So AI, I mean, we're looking at some tools right now that are going to make marketers' lives so much better because they're going to be able to ask really basic questions and let AI do the hard query work to assemble the answers. But you better be built on quality data if you're going to depend on those answers.
When we talk about the quality data, one of the questions coming in is how should companies be preparing their first party data strategies to stay competitive in 2025 and beyond? And just to tee that up a little bit more, I think of it as like, when's the best time to plant a tree? Well, it was a year ago or however long ago. If we're all leaning into first party data being the foundation, what are some of the best practices that marketers should be looking at doing right now so that a year from now they have that first party data that will provide that foundation? Mark, we'll start with you first, and then we'll go to Jay.
Yeah, I go back to you've got to start by building a truth set. You've got to start with really understanding the data in your current systems, right? And that kind of goes back to your planting tree analogy. It's not sexy and it's not a panacea, but you've got to start with really understanding the data that you're licensing today and start to separate the quality from the not so good data. And,
Yep.
and that benefits everyone because number one, now you can go to your leadership and you can say, we vetted this data and here's, and we know this is quality data because, right? You have to answer the question, how much do I trust this data? And then in addition to that, we're finding that a lot of these marketing infrastructures are bloated with bad data. Well, you can also save all those licensing fees because if the data is not performant, if the data is not accurate, and you can vet 3 or 4 data sources together and understand that, then you also start to save money. And again, in this environment of trying to cut costs, right? Build a true set, save some data on licensing, and really double down on the partners that are providing the high quality data.
Yep. Jay, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would say if Mark is focused, rightfully so, on the quality of data, I'll just throw this out as maybe a little back to the basics, right? Just keep in mind things like do you have your accurate use cases? Because AI, the Marketunist a couple weeks ago had a great cartoon. I don't know if anyone saw it, but it was a picture of a giant hammer that said AI on it. And the point was, hey, AI fundamentally is a tool. And if you don't have great data, it doesn't help. But then if you don't know what you're trying to target for, right, everything looks like a nail. So how do you make sure you've got all of your great use cases? You have even standardized on language within your organization. You have educated yourself, your attorneys, your IT leaders. You have your statement of principles that sits on top of your SOP. And of course, don't forget that, in addition to AI, there's still, again, some back to the basics. Are you really maximizing your MMM and MTA models that can be very much more useful in this world? So I think there's a lot of basics, some blocking and tackling that can kind of be forgotten in this world of AI. So get your truth set, like Mark was talking about. Make sure you've got your fundamentals, and you're in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, certainly. As we all talk about AI, it's not just how more efficient we can be, it's how much more effective we can be. So the accuracy and the quality of the data becomes paramount. One other question that came through was really, about, if Google will change their mind, not deprecating the third-party cookie. I think both of you in my conversations have said before that whether they do or not, it's all heading in the same direction, where we have to plan for a life without a third-party cookie. Would you both agree with that, or is there anything else you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I've been to the Googleplex a couple times, and I'm going to be somewhat tongue in cheek, but just imagine like a giant pipe out of Super Mario World that is over the offices, and it's just pouring money through nonstop. At the end of the day, there's never been a more profitable business than third-party cookie-based digital advertising. There's no way in hell that's going to change as much as they kind of dip their needs. It's the innovator's dilemma, right? So
Yeah.
at the fundamentally, you have to prepare, but they're not going to get rid of third-party cookies. But with all these walled gardens, everything we talked about, you've got to prepare for it.
Sure. And Mark?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's got their opinion on what Google is going to do, and I think Google is going to take a page out of the Apple playbook and just make it user choice, because, right, that insulates them from the regulators, which they're having a pretty hard time with. But I go back to, even if cookies don't go away, if 60% of I mean, Oracle. It's so funny. Oracle Data Cloud several years ago, when I was still at Bizzo, they said, "Hey, we're going to show everybody like what's on your third-party cookie." And you can go into Oracle and you can actually look, and it would show you your profile. And I was female, I was Asian, I drove a Mercedes, I drove a Nissan, I lived in, it's like the data inside that cookie was just completely random. And so even if third-party cookies stay, you've got to vet that data and make sure the data that you're receiving from those cookies is accurate. So from my perspective, again, whether cookies go away or not, you still have to understand the data behind those cookies.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Well, look, we're coming up on time here, but I want to touch on one last question. Somebody had asked, a data axle question, and saying that data axle sounds the same as Adstra, V12/Porch, and other advertising specialty data companies. How do we differentiate? And when we talk about Audience 360, the solution that I put up on the board, it's about starting from scratch. It's about helping the brand to bring together all the data they have, all of their first-party data, the multiple third-party sources they use, from Data Axle, from Adstra, from V12, from Experian, from LiveRamp, right on down the line, to build that enterprise identity spine to handle a lot of these key techniques. Some of those solutions down the road might not have any Data Axle data in them. It's about helping the brand to stitch together all of that information, manage all of those IDs, and then be able to deal with privacy compliance, as well as all the marketing strategies and techniques that each one of the point solutions want to drive higher ROI for. But if anybody has any other questions, or whoever wrote that would like to dive deeper, feel free to send me an email at mark.sabatini@dataaxle or at data-axle.com, or you could just find me on LinkedIn and shoot me a note. But I certainly want to thank Jay and Mark for your time today. Certainly great input and feedback. And for everybody that's on here, check your email. You're going to get our latest white paper, Building an AI-Ready Data Foundation. And the final piece next Tuesday, Wednesday, I'll be at Exchange or Programmatic IO in New York City. And I hope to see you there. If you're going to be there and you want to have a conversation, shoot me a note. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.